This is a presentation on preliminary considerations for neurodivergent affirming mental health counseling across the lifespan. My name is Stacia Langell. I'm a white cis woman living in New Hampshire, and my pronouns are she and her. To start, I feel it is important to answer the question of why the topic of neurodiversity affirming mental health care matters to me personally, and why I think it should matter to all of us on a professional level. At the time of this recording, I am a graduate student in clinical mental health counseling. I am the mom to a fabulous 4-year-old. That's my daughter and I in the photo, with Opal, the miniature horse, trying to snag an apple through the fence. I own a horse farm where I have the great pleasure of hosting an occupational therapy program run by incredibly talented and affirming professionals. When I started hosting this program, I was in a spot as a parent where it took every bit of everything I had to navigate the day with my daughter. Attachment parenting alone wasn't providing enough information. It was a persistent challenge to maintain regulation for both my daughter and myself. It was sheer coincidence that Heather, the owner of Play and Prosper Occupational Therapy, approached me about seeing her clients at my farm. While observing her sessions, I realized that although I didn't yet understand what she was doing, it was exactly what we needed. Heather helped me better understand neurocognitive experience. She pointed me to numerous resources, which I will share later. I learned that had I attempted to simply modify the visible behaviors, I would have failed as a parent to acknowledge my daughter as a person with a unique and valid experience. The more I have learned, the more I have realized that affirming relationship-first approaches, which is a thread through every aspect of my life, are also critical to the type of mental health counseling I want to practice. This presentation is a baseline introduction for affirming interaction and care. My hope is that it will serve as a launching point for viewers in examining our own internalized ableism and how that plays a role in our future as mental health counselors. Before we can understand neurodivergent affirming counseling, we need an idea of what neurodivergence entails. This slide shows a simplified visualization of some areas of neurodiversity. All human beings represent a point on a visualization of neurodiversity. Some of us are neurotypical, some of us are autistic, some of us are neurodivergent, and some of us land on a point where multiple neurotypes meet. I would like everyone to take note of how small of a portion is represented by the neurotypical circle, and yet how many of our systems and environments are designed around neurotypical norms. Also consider what that means for the voices you hear, including my own, and the potential ableism in our common default identity as neurotypical. In light of that, I want to name that I understand my identity as a neurotypical or allistic person. Although that is how I understand my experience, I also choose to actively communicate areas in which my preferences, needs, and experiences differ from neurotypical norms of pro-social behavior. I adopted this approach of actively identifying my specific strengths, weaknesses, and experiences for 2 reasons. First, as a mother, it allows me to model awareness and acknowledgement of personal needs, creating a space for my daughter to do the same. I extended this practice outside of my home after I learned of the ableist impact of labeling a person as high or low functioning. Shorthand labels and diagnostic grading categories may make it easy for neurotypical identifying people to simply put someone in a box. That has real and negative impacts on access to care and resources and should be avoided. Instead, it makes sense to explicitly name needs and concerns. So just like I told you, my pronouns are she and her when I introduced myself, what if we all get in the habit of saying what we really need, even if, or perhaps especially if, we represent a dominant identity to help create a safe space for everyone? I would also like to argue that this approach directly correlates to our work as counselors in creating a safe space for our clients. What if I told you there is no such thing as a normal brain? What if we actively accept that the big umbrella of neurodivergence includes more than it excludes? And if that's true, why are we subjecting ourselves to harmful norms of neurotypical prosocial behavior? Why do I identify as neurotypical when I know most common social situations, quite frankly, aren't my cup of tea? And I know the same is true for many people I know. Take a moment. What's a need that you have that is in conflict with the systemic structure that envelopes you? What happens when you can't fulfill that need? Have I caught your attention yet? If this is a new topic for you, it may be helpful to hear some of the common diagnostic language used when trying to categorize experience. These include identifiers such as autism, ADHD, dyspraxia, dyslexia, OCD, being gifted, sensory processing differences, and more. Given all of this, how do we adjust our own attitudes towards neurodivergence as future mental health counselors? I'll give you a hint on my opinion. I think we should chuck the DSM-5 right out the window on this. Just as we have learned in every other instance in which a group has been marginalized or stigmatized, we must listen to the voices of the people who actually live this. And as with much of the bias we have seen and lived across different spectrums of the human experience, the scholarly literature is lagging. So while I will include limited peer-reviewed sources, I will not be giving voice to demeaning or faulty research performed by neurotypical individuals in this presentation. Neurodiversity is part of the same beautiful range of humanity that includes differences in age, race, gender, and ethnicity. As mental health counselors, our multicultural education must include multicultural fluency, examination of our own bias, and becoming actively anti-ableist. Part of that is understanding what the neurodiversity movement is talking about. To recap, neurodiversity refers to the natural variation in human neurocognitive function. It includes the full range of neurotypical and neurodivergent identities. There is no type of brain function that is right or best, although there are power differentials. The neurodiversity movement is a civil rights social movement that seeks equality regardless of neurocognitive function. As ethical mental health counselors, this is a concept we should be familiar with. With regard to some of the ways you may see the neurodiversity movement in action, here are a couple examples of popular meme types seen in the neurodiversity movement. If this is something you would like to learn more about, I strongly recommend joining some online groups, reading the files, and being a fly on the wall. I have found the Facebook pages Autism Inclusivity, Neurodiversity Affirming Psychotherapist, and Giraffe Party to be particularly helpful in my education. As a final note, this is also an important time to clarify that for the vast majority of autistic people, there is a strong preference for identity first versus person first language. This may be contrary to what you have been taught, and this clip will help to clarify language use.
You've probably been told that it's wrong to use someone's disability as a label, that because people are more than their disability, it's better to say person with epilepsy rather than an epileptic. Person-first language places the person ahead of their disability. A person with traumatic brain injury, a person with schizophrenia. And many individuals prefer to be referred to in this way. A survey of Facebook users with disability elicited the following responses.
100% person first. We are not defined by what others suppose to be deficits. All are differently unique. All people should be known by who they are, not what they are.
Person first. I may be bipolar, but I would rather people judge me for me, not my illness.
I usually like people to say a person who is blind, not a blind person. I am a person first, blind second.
But there are also individuals who prefer that the disability or disorder come first in the description. This is often called identity-first language.
I have cerebral palsy and I prefer identity-first language. I consider my disability to be an inextricable part of my identity as a human being. It isn't negative to say I'm disabled. It's a statement of fact. My disability is a huge part of my identity and how I experience the world. To me, person-first language implies a degree of shame or negativity about disability. I embrace my disability because it influences so much of how I see and experience the world.
In particular, there's a preference for identity-first language in the deaf community and the autism community.
I am autistic. I cannot remove autism from my body. It is my neurotype. Just as I am tall, I am autistic. I do not have tallness. It makes being tall sound negative that way. Saying I have autism separates the autism from me. It makes autism sound negative. People can have cancer, but cancer is viewed as negative and separate from the person. I am autistic. I am tall too.
Identity first. Disability is part of who I am. It's helped me grow as a person and brings me together with the community. Also, it's not my health that disables me. It's society's unwillingness to accommodate us.
In respect of these two viewpoints, I often switch between person-first and identity-first language when I'm speaking in general. But the most important thing when advocating for someone is to find out how they like to be described and addressed.
So now that we have reviewed some basic concepts, let's look at some therapeutic approaches. If you are involved in any aspect of neurodivergence therapy, I bet you have heard of ABA. If you haven't, very succinctly, applied behavioral analysis is a scientific technique concerned with applying empirical approaches based upon the principles of respondent and operant conditioning to change behavior of social significance. In other words, an ABA-trained therapist decides which behaviors are acceptable and uses a variety of behaviorism techniques to incentivize some behaviors and disincentivize others. It is well funded by insurance and government organizations alike, which makes ABA a popular option in spite of research studies proving its lack of effectiveness. And I'll reference some of those later. This approach of using operant conditioning to create neurotypical behaviors in neurodivergent people is significantly problematic when viewed through the lens of the neurodiversity movement, which seeks equality across the full range of human neurocognitive function. In terms of considering affirming options for mental health counseling, as is the purpose of this presentation, ABA does not make the cut as an affirming option. Anti-ABA activism is an integral part of the neurodiversity movement. I understand that many of us know and love people who have either experienced this therapy with seemingly positive outcomes or know someone who loves children and practices some form of behaviorism as part of the best information they have on how to support and assist those children. Maybe it's even something you have practiced or have an interest in. I am asking you to please take a deep breath on any possible gut reaction to their critique of ABA and bear with me. I'm asking you to consider, in much the same way that so many well-intentioned people subjected fellow humans to conversion therapy in an attempt to eradicate the quote unquote mental illness of homosexuality, ABA attempts to coerce neurodivergent people into neurotypical perceptions of acceptable behavior. ABA is every bit as abusive as conversion therapy. And I gotta say, I don't think those people were well-intentioned either. But that's my personal opinion. One of my personal preferred learning resources for this subject is the Great Big ABA Opposition Resource List on the Stop ABA Support Autistics WordPress site. If this is an area of interest for you, or perhaps even of skepticism, this is a means of hearing autistic voices without asking someone to do emotional labor for you. There is a link in the presentation notes as well as on the references page if you are interested. It is also important to note that ABA can masquerade under completely different names. Sometimes even an occupational therapist or a cognitive behavioral therapist can use ABA. If you are interested in learning more about how different types of therapies can masquerade as ABA, I'm going to post some questions on the next couple of slides for your future reference. These are anecdotal and were questions compiled in January of 2020 by Katie Hines, a mom on the spectrum with 2 children on the spectrum, which is how she identifies herself. I'm going to scroll through these next few slides fairly quickly in the interest of time, but I would like to invite you to consider pausing the recording and reading each question. Notice where you may have experienced some of these questions in your own life, how that feels in your body, and how you might use that information in future interactions, especially with children. When really processing the content of this material, it becomes apparent to me that this material, much like all of the neurodivergent affirming information I have accessed, offers a framework for how we should be treating all people. I experience these ideas as basic guidelines for humane interaction. Consider, what if we left ableism and adultism and external control psychology in the rearview mirror and simply treated each other with dignity? That's some really heavy stuff. And if you were able to take the time and pause and read through those questions, I encourage you to take a break if you need it and move however you need for your own regulation before we move on. Although I have been centering neurodivergent voices in this presentation, there is scholarly research that complements these narratives. And I should clarify, I misspoke there. I'm centering non-peer-reviewed neurodivergent voices. So here's that attempt at the scholarly literature, right? In one study, nearly half of the ABA exposed respondents met the diagnostic threshold for PTSD. In another paper published in 2020, which claims to be the first paper to take an in-depth qualitative approach to autistic experiences of ABA, reflections from 10 participants were indicative of a predominantly detrimental impact of ABA. There's a wealth of information available on this subject, and focusing on ABA does not help us provide mental health care across a neurodiverse spectrum. Please remember, neurodivergent people do not need therapy because they are neurodivergent. Neurodivergent people access mental health care for the same myriad reasons as the neurotypical population, and it is a moral imperative to provide affirming care to all our clients. There is another self-identifying neurodivergent voice that I am incredibly grateful to be able to share with you. This person has granted me permission to share their words, although they will remain anonymous. These words are copied from an online conversation to which I was privy and are direct quotes from an autistic mental health counselor. Before I begin, I really want to specifically thank this person for allowing me to share their words. I felt a great deal of discomfort at the prospect of asking someone to perform emotional labor for me in this manner, especially given any power dynamics that might be at play. So thank you. The points that I feel are the most salient from this conversation will be bulleted on the slide as I read them, though other points may speak more clearly to you. This person writes, DBT is overall more validating than CBT. They're still both problematic beyond the surface. They both have some valuable skills to offer. They fall short in the long run. DBT emotional regulation skills focus all on distraction in some way. DBT is helpful when you're in crisis all the time and helps with interpersonal relationships. But distraction as a coping skill doesn't heal trauma. Using mindfulness only to meditate and get through moments doesn't heal trauma. It gets you by, reduces needs for maladaptive behavior by replacing them with different skills. CBT focuses on everything cognitive, top-down processes. Their core belief is that thoughts lead to emotions, lead to behavior. Trauma-focused CBT focuses on trauma narratives in an exposure therapy way, which can help people. However, big trauma is stored in our nervous system, which isn't cognitive. Autism, ADHD, and trauma are bottom-up processes. Stimuli leads to body sensations and physiological experience, which sometimes leads to thoughts, and that leads to behavior. When you touch a hot stovetop, you don't think about removing your hand. You just remove your hand without thinking. Then think about how that hurt. In the future, you also don't think about if you should touch a hot stovetop. You just don't. Or if you're driving and a car pulls out in front of you, you automatically press the brakes without thinking about it. CBT is more ableistic than DBT, but DBT has CBT incorporated. CBT is ableistic because of their core belief that if you just change the way you think, you can also change your behavior. While neuroplasty is a very valid thing, it's not the one-size-fits-all box that CBT and DBT say it is. CBT and DBT is therapist-led versus client-led. They're invalidating on that bottom-up processes level. I have clients who have been in residential facilities and psych wards that throw DBT and CBT at them, and they haven't helped. I went through 5 years of DBT. While I owe a lot of my survival to DBT, it was just that, survival, not thriving. I'm still in therapy, working on healing from my traumas and working heavily on unlearning DBT emotional regulation skills. Not only am I autistic, but I also have very complex attachment and developmental trauma. I live in disassociation. DBT strengthened my ability to disassociate and not feel emotions. Any sign of emotion, and I unconsciously distract myself and become more disassociated versus feeling the emotions and learning how to feel them without needing maladaptive behavior. I had a trainer tell us in the training that if a client says they're not able to remember their trauma, they're choosing not to remember. As an autistic person, I can't think my way out of a sensory hell day. I can't use affirmations to change my neural pathways to make my brain process information not autistically. I can't positively think my way out of burnout. It's not ethical for me to radically accept that I have to live in constant discomfort as an autistic person in neurotypical environments. Honestly, 80% of the time, I don't have thoughts in association with emotions, and my thoughts don't dictate that eye contact is uncomfortable or fleece gives my tactile sensory inputs pain. I can't think my way out of a meltdown. Not being accepted within neurotypical social standards isn't a cognitive distortion. It's the very valid truth that us autistic people face. For children, they don't respect autonomy, support, or learning their bodies and what their bodies are telling them. Before we move on, I want to take another moment to send my gratitude to the person who wrote these words. My priority in organizing this presentation was to provide you with preliminary context and a meaningful lens of interpreting whether your therapeutic approach might be actively harmful for a neurodivergent client. That has left us with a very limited amount of time to review what affirming care actually looks like in practice. However, I firmly believe that approaching this presentation from this perspective provides the best foundation for ensuring multicultural competence with regard to preparing fellow counseling students to provide neurodivergent affirming mental health care. Since I only have a couple of short minutes left, I'm going to focus the remaining time referring you to the very best resources I have been privy to and provide a brief summary of common themes on the next slide. Honestly, a brief overview of any of these works within the context of a slideshow would not provide sufficient insight to apply in practice. And as such, I strongly encourage everyone to order their own copies. While many of these books are geared towards work with children, they offer valuable perspective across the lifespan. With regard to summarizing common themes, please note that it is entirely my non-expert review of the literature I referenced on the preceded recommending resources slide. Whew, let's try that again. On the preceding recommended resources slide. While there are numerous specific skills, the following common themes in neurodivergent affirming mental health care are what I want to note. First, support mind-body awareness. Seek regulation and relationship first. I don't know how you do both of those things first, but the first one was the first one on the list. Also remember that environment matters and alter it as indicated. Validation and genuine empathy are prerequisite. Be person-centered. And remember, capacity and resilience are built through safety and trust. In conclusion, I want to highlight three main learning points in this presentation. First, neurodiversity is an aspect of diversity. Second, neurodivergent people do not need therapy because they are neurodivergent. And third, neurodivergent affirming mental health care centers the experience of the client. Thank you for joining me on this journey. I hope you gained as much from viewing this presentation as I gained from making it. If any future viewers of this presentation find problematic language or ideas, please contact me so I can make necessary adjustments. And with that, I will scroll through my reference pages and say goodbye.